Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Nicstalgia. I am here with one of my great friends today, Shakivla, and we're going to talk about all things pop culture. Of course, our mutual love for 90s R&B, Spice Girls, The Amanda Show, to name a few. So welcome, Shakivla. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me. Your launch for this podcast was so damn cute. I'm like, please put me on the show. I want to talk.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And like I just mentioned, the Amanda Show. So during quarantine, you did an IG live series every Sunday night, right? Sunday night. Yep. And it was called The Girls Room. And yep. I'm like, that was probably my favorite segment from the Amanda Show. And I would say a good 10% of everything that my immediate family says to each other is either a direct or some kind of variation of a quote from the Amanda Show. I don't know why.
No, I don't. I think people forget how iconic that was. And also how iconic Amanda Bynes was. Like, she had her own skit comedy show and it was epic.
Yeah, absolutely. She was so talented, and I think that it's been really interesting seeing kind of like the arc of her story. And while that's like a whole another topic, I think that it does show us too kind of where to like draw the line with appreciating life versus art. I think that in pop culture, like that topic comes up a lot, especially because we look back and we're like, okay, but how was that show made? Even when you have a rewatch of a show or a podcast that comes out about a rewatch of a show, you're able to examine these things from the past, but from the present. And I think it's very obvious all the things that would be different now or that we could change now. But at the same time, people are always going to continue creating. So I think it's a really great opportunity to stay creative.
Yeah. It's also really interesting too, when we talk about pop culture and you being a pop culture expert and loving the 90s. And we also have to, digest what it means when these popular people that we loved in the 90s make mistakes. And like, do we forgive them? How do we forgive them? How do we not forgive them, but still appreciate the work that they created, the art that they created? And when you were talking about Amanda Bynes, that of course made me think of Stacey Dash from Clueless. Mm-hmm. And we have like grown to learn that Stacey is not the best person and she's pretty anti-Black. But we love Dion so much in that film, and so it's like, how do we grapple with both of that? And I feel like that's just like the constant problem with our love for the 90s is that we have to now realize that the people that we loved before may not be the best people.
Yeah, I think that I hate to even like bring up their names, but I think R. Kelly is one of the better examples of this too, where you continue to see people's music be propagated by the industry and you continue to see people being supported, whether or not they have morals, do the right thing, or even support members of their own community or not. And that's something that I think about a lot because that is the difference between then and now. I think there's definitely a way to appreciate then, but knowing I almost have that kind of test in my mind when I watch something now from then. I'd be like, ooh, that didn't fly now, or that couldn't fly now, or that's problematic. But of course, they were at their vantage point from 25, 30 years ago. And I see it was different.
Just like, I mean, we've seen it, Sex and the City, obviously. And I mean, I didn't really watch Sex and the City back then. I watched the reboot because I was interested to see what would happen. But it's kind of similar to my L Word in the early 2000s. The L Word was absolutely horrible. Like the commentary was truly representative of the time. But as somebody who rewatches it every single time I have a breakup, I'm cringing in a different way every single time. You find something new that is just 100% wildly inappropriate.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that it's so funny too, because at the same time, a show like The L Word and even the first round of Queer Eye too, where queer characters are the main characters. And that was even still something that was an anomaly back then. It's funny because those shows are looked at as trailblazers.
Yeah.
And yet it's still different when you're making a show, and yes, it's about you, but you still it's difficult to articulate.
That is interesting, though, that you called it. They were trailblazers, and they truly did open up a whole world of entertainment that wasn't there before. But when Gen Z sits and watches it now, they're like you put this on TV,
Mm-hmm.
But it's a different time.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that things have evolved so much. And we were just talking about, I wanted you to mention kind of the difference between growing up. So you moved around, you've lived on the East Coast, the West Coast, back and forth, and just kind of describing how life and how playing with your friends was similar and different.
Yeah. So my background is I'm originally from San Diego, California. But I was raised in a suburb outside of San Diego called Temecula. And Temecula would be considered kind of like a starter town where new families go. At the time, it was completely empty, only a few subdivisions, and now it has turned into something bigger than what I ever could have imagined. But I was there back and forth between Southern California and South Carolina my entire life. And so my childhood is really split between two different types of cultures. And in Temecula, I was in a predominantly white neighborhood. And in South Carolina, I was in a predominantly Black neighborhood, predominantly Black school. So play was very different. In both places. Money looked very different in both places, right? So there was just like a whole bunch of in California, we're playing with toys, we're playing with Razor scooters and Beanie Babies and, all the toys that we can get our hands on. And in South Carolina, we did a lot of play outside, right? A lot of make believe, a lot of going on walks. So it's kind of, those two different experiences that I had. It's also interesting too, when I got into middle school, I spent some time in South Carolina. And when you think about middle school, the early 2000s, this is your Sierra, your Bow Wows and Little Romeos, days, right? And that's what my life was like in South Carolina, just surrounded by a lot of Black music, Black artists, Black trends. When I moved back to California in middle school, and I met up basically with all my friends who were there when I was there in elementary school, they were gothic and like emo, and that's where I was like, the Paramore was coming in and the My Chemical Romance and all of the other stuff. And I could not quite understand it. I could not quite get it, I was still very much in my, what happened? We were like Soulja Boy and you and all over the place. And now we're in dark makeup and lashes and dark hair and everything. It was so different. It was so different.
That is really funny. I thought that you were going to say something along the lines of, that, and I guess I would say San Diego inclusive of LA too, where there's more of the surf culture and Hollister and that kind of thing too, which I'm sure was around, but the contrast too is just so funny. And I think it was cool too, seeing music evolve around the early 2000s too, when 50 Cent first came out. That was really huge. Destiny's Child, even back in the 90s, was really huge. I've always been a huge Missy Elliott fan, and just watching her music videos on MTV. I was like, she's just
videos.
Yeah. And like, she's just I always look to her as a source of inspiration, as someone who truly does her own thing. And she constantly just talks about that. The fact that people literally have always thought that she was crazy, and she just did whatever she thought was best to do. And it's truly reflected, in everything that she does.
She, just recently won the VMA Vanguard Award, which is like extremely overdue. Like, she should have won that years ago. But, you know, it takes a while to give people their flowers sometimes. But she is an icon.
Yeah, absolutely. And even seeing her in pop culture now, I follow her on Instagram and Twitter, and even the way that she will compose these inspirational messages, and they'll be like, don't give up. People will say you can't, you can, keep going. And it's just like the absolute best. And recently I tweeted at her and she responded with a purple heart. And I'm like, okay, I don't know if it's her assistant, her dog, Miss Fendi Dior. I don't care who it was. It's someone with the password. So it's good enough for me.
Oh, that's so dope.
Yeah. So I'm like, okay, I will take that as approval, or at the very, very least, acknowledge of my existence. So as far as I'm concerned, that's amazing. And I also have to mention your Spice Girls tattoo. Speaking of people who are just iconic and still give me inspiration 25 years later.
I know.
I mean, spice up your life.
Yes. So I'm absolutely in love with the Spice Girls. And of course it's, you know, from childhood. It was actually an interesting thing too about living in a predominantly white neighborhood when Spice Girls were at their height. I guess I was probably only like 5 or 6, really. I don't know why I felt like I was so much older, but I was really young. And of course I was always Scary Spice, which was something that like I had to, I don't know, come to terms with, or just like accept, because I was the only Black girl in class. I was the only Black girl in my friend group. And so it only made sense that I was Scary Spice, even though like the depths of me wanted to be Baby Spice. I think that like, honestly, when I think about it, that's actually going to be a really dope Halloween costume if I ever like think about kind of turning my own childhood trauma on its head and like dressing up as a Spice Girl that I actually feel like I want to be. Anyways, but that's a whole nother thing. But yeah, so when I went to London, I absolutely love London, and I finally got an opportunity to go. And I decided to get a tattoo while I was there. And my only thought was like, why not get a London inspired tattoo? So I have a tattoo on my ankle and it says spice up your life. And it made me pretty popular on Tinder as well. So I posted it as one of my pictures on Tinder.
That's absolutely amazing, and a great way to attract people, obviously. And I really quickly wanted to speak on that too, because when I heard that the girls originally were just known by their names, and it really wasn't until they broke out into the US that they really started going by the nicknames, and the nicknames had been given to them by a radio show host in London who was an old white guy. And he's like, yeah, that one Baby, that one's Scary. And when I realized that that's where the names came from, because it'd be one thing if Mel B was like, I'm Scary Spice. And you're like, okay, cool. Like, cool. Yeah. But knowing that a white man gave her that name,
that sucks.
That sucks. And that made me upset, because it's like, it's a racial stereotype. I'm just like, really? That's the only name that you could really take and put a negative spin on it, and tying that to the only Black girl in the group is not okay. And so I think that, right? And like figuring out that that's where that came from, and being like, you know what? I'm sure that Mel B's had to embrace like the ebbs and flows of being Black and living in London, being in a pop group, so many things throughout her life. And so yeah, it's just kind of like a tough space to be in, but just like our conversation from earlier, how we can still appreciate them and, you know, always just having that level of respect for people.
Yeah. And I can only imagine all the other things. You know, you pick your battles and you kind of like choose the hills that you plan to die on. And I am 100% sure that if I, you know, pull back the curtain of the Spice Girls, I would find so many more problematic things. We already know some of the music is a little problematic too, like some of the lyrics. Again, you know what I mean? You pick and choose. And like at the time when I was 5 or 6 years old, Spice Girls gave my little self like all the confidence in the world. And like, I cannot deny that impact that it had on my life, and it still does, you know? So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's interesting too how some of the lyrics in songs, not just problematic, but they're also inappropriate. And like you were saying, we were so young and you just don't really realize how young you were when you're like, wait, that song came out in 1998 or whatever. And ones that come to mind are Too Close by Next. That would probably be like my number one song where...
Ooh, I need to hear it. How does it go? Sing it.
Let me think of some appropriate... Oh, we're dancing real close.
Oh, yeah.
Dun, 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 real. And what goes...
for me.
Right,
Perfect.
but even those lyrics are like not... They didn't mean you're making it difficult for me. Yeah. And so when I got older, I was like, the way I was just dancing around, singing that song, I guess my mom didn't think anything of it. It was on the light radio station.
I remember I was in the car with one of my best friends, Ayana, and I was the type of kid that like, I was the kid that was the plus one on every family's vacation or whatnot. My mom wasn't a huge vacationer. But she was completely fine with me going and leaving and being with other families as much as I wanted to. And so I remember I was in the car with my friend Ayana. We were on the way to maybe her grandmother's house or something. And we were in the back seat because, I mean, that was when everybody had the huge Ford expeditions or excursions. And so we were all the way in the back dancing to R. Kelly's Ignition. And we were doing the dance moves and stuff like that and going like that. And her mom saw us from the rear window and she literally just turned the music off. Like, I'm not having this. Y'all are not about to sit here and sing this song. Like, it's not inappropriate.
That is so funny. And you love 90s R&B. I love 90s R&B. What kind of influence did that have on you? And what were some of your favorite songs or artists?
Yeah. I mean, it was one of those things where it's like my mom was always listening to it. So it was like, it's like the background. It's like the soundtrack of my childhood. We also were like always in the car. Temecula is about an hour and a half outside of San Diego, and we have family in San Diego and friends in San Diego. So we were often driving back and forth between Temecula and San Diego, like every single weekend. So I spent so much time in the car, and that was the music that was on. I knew and still know so many lyrics to some of these 90s, like early 90s R&B songs. To me, it's just like they scream so much soul. Like, you know, it's so crazy to me because I'm sure that when these songs came out, there were people who were my age, 30 and up, who hated them and thought like, oh, hip hop is dead, or, you know, what happened to smooth jazz? You know what I mean? Because now here I am as a 30-year-old looking at what they're calling R&B today. And I don't resonate with it. I like, you know, I negate the fact that it is even considered R&B. You know, is sometimes I'm like, how can you put like SWV in the same playing field as like Doja Cat, you know, or like, or even SZA, if I'm being honest, you know what I mean? So there's just like this level of soul that is in 90s R&B that is completely missing from what R&B is today that I'm like addicted to, right? Like I love a love ballad. Like I love being able to get on my knees and sing to like the top of my lungs, you know, with In Vogue or Whitney or Mary J. Blige. You know what I mean? Like that stuff fills my soul. It's like my soundtrack. My life soundtrack is 90s R&B.
That's amazing. I love that saying. And granted, it's kind of like live, laugh, lovey now. But if the love isn't like 90s R&B, I don't want it. Mm-hmm. And there is truth in that statement. And right, those truly soul-filling songs where you can just sing on the top of your lungs and truly feel it in your body. And I watched the Mary J. Blige documentary not too long ago. And it was just wonderful, and seeing Mary evolve throughout her career and how she's always doing things to help other people and especially help other Black women. And it's so admirable, and I really love her. And so when you flash back to the 1993, you're like, wow, that is someone whose career has truly stood the test of time. Her music is still beloved by people today. And yesterday I listened to Doja Cat's cover of Celebrity Skin by Hole that was used in a Taco Bell commercial for the Super Bowl. Like that's the closest thing we have to R&B today. Right.
Yeah,
it feels like
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say it feels like that's, and I guess music is just different now, especially like what I would call TikTok music, but it just seems like it's missing.
Oh yeah. It's 100% a gap that is missing. And you can tell that it's missing because everybody, not just us searching for nostalgia, but everybody, they're still using this talent. You know what I mean? Like they're still like, it's not just these, 30-year-old millennials who are clenching back for childhood. Like literally everything is. Every brand, media companies, like that is their stitch. That's like their content right now is, if you follow, any of the publishing companies on Instagram, InStyle Magazine, The Cut, whatever, they're still hinging a lot of their content on 90s stuff, because the new stuff, whatever is here now, is just still kind of like blah, I would never have imagined that I would still see people talking about J-Lo and Ben Affleck. You know what I mean? Like even regardless of what their relationship looks like today, that is for some companies a heavy part of their content strategy. You know what I mean? Like it's just it's not dead, and we desperately want it back. / we desperately are missing something in the media right now that is making us want to go back to the 90s.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think nostalgia being us looking back, something that we went through, and also nowstalgia, people who didn't live through it the first time, Gen Z, who were like, oh, learning about the 90s, this is cool. I like to think that Nicstalgia is a combination of the both of them. Because it's like, I am not just sitting here talking about the 90s, because sometimes people are like, oh, well, I wish I could go back. I'm like, I wouldn't necessarily say that. It's just that, again, you appreciate the past, you inform yourself in the present, and then you create what kind of ever future you want to see. And I think after having experienced myself the nostalgia of the 1970s, because I'm obsessed and my mom's like, what? You weren't even there. After going through that myself, I really just have this soft spot for young people today who are interested about our lives.
But do you remember, do people forget that like you mentioned, you had like a 70s moment, but when I was in high school, middle school, we were definitely like grabbing for the 80s. I remember cutting off t-shirts and wearing them like off the shoulder. I remember all of like the neon colors and like big scrunchies and everything like that, windbreakers. I remember the whole moment. And it's just interesting to, everyone says it stop, trends repeat themselves, but like we truly are living each decade. We're living in the other decade,
Yeah, absolutely. There's about a 20-year trend cycle. And so I would say in the late 90s, I was living my best 70s life and wearing Mary Janes. I've been wearing platform shoes since I was 7 years old. And I had tie-dye shirts. I had a hippie-themed birthday party. But like I mentioned, the groovival trend that I love so much lacks the socio-political overtones that the actual 1970s did, because economically, we were in a very different place in the 90s than we were in the 70s.
Right.
And in the 2000s, I would say absolutely, especially toward the end of the decade is when I went into college. And when you would go to parties, those neon parties were huge, and everyone would wear a white t-shirt and those neon sunglasses, like Wayfarer sunglasses, but different neon colors.
Yes, and we would, like in college, you can get them. They were just giving them out. Yeah,
right. And then Red Bull would probably sponsor them or whatever. Yeah, and it's really interesting seeing how brands are becoming a part of the moment too. And whether it's a new brand or it's a legacy brand, even just seeing how Abercrombie rebranded. I mean, they were the coolest of the cool, and then they were just the absolute worst. And I think now they're kind of somewhere in the middle. It is very interesting to see.
Did you see? I bought my first pair of Abercrombie pants in the fall of 2021. And I remember the day my friend Olivia, who works with me at iFund Women, she was like, "Have you seen the new Abercrombie website?" And I was like, no, like, why would I be on Abercrombie and Fitch? Like, what in the world? Who do I look like? At the time when it was popular, there was no way I could even fit my leg into an Abercrombie pair of jeans. Like, it just wasn't going to happen. And so she showed me the website, and instantly you could tell that they were in the middle of a rebrand. They had, like, on the front page, it was a spotlight of all of their Black employees. And some other contexts or whatnot, their pictures, you could tell that were plus size models and everything. And I was like, I guess I got to get me a pair of these jeans. And I got them, loved them. And then I posted about it on Instagram, and everybody was like, wait, what? You got these jeans from Abercrombie? So no, that's so real. That's so real.
That's really interesting. And I want to know from you how you think that companies can be a part of the moment. Like, where do you draw that line between, oh, this is 2022, this is how we need to run a business, we do need to be size inclusive, we do need to reflect racial and different types of diversity in our advertising? Like, where do you draw the line? Is it consistency in being performative versus just like being with the times?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's a really good question that I don't know the answer to, because I feel like because I manage social for a brand as well, it's so hard. It's like, how do you integrate how do you integrate these changes into the story, the narrative of your brand, and not be performative? That is very, very, very difficult. I know I appreciate brands who tap onto, nano or micro influencers. It's very helpful for me when I see people that like are almost me. You know what I mean? Like people that I follow on a daily basis, maybe even people that I've met, like especially living in New York City, you find yourself in spaces with, I call them lesbians, or, a little bit of some influencers. You find yourself in these spaces, and when you see them wearing these brands, it's so much more, I feel so much more likely to purchase. So I guess my answer to the question is, it feels performative if a brand was to partner with Beyonce, right? Or if they were to partner with insert big Black artist name here, right? But when they have reached out and delved into these very micro communities to find people to use as brand partners and pay them, you know what I mean? That's where I feel like kind of that line might be met, if that makes sense, you know?
Yeah.
Like I've been to some websites, and I wish I could name them but I don't remember. But I've been to some websites where the model for the product is actually a person's Instagram post, you know? Mm-hmm. And I don't know. I think I find that very special.
Yeah, definitely. When did you feel like you saw someone who, like how you just kind of mentioned, was like you or reminded you or reflected or represented in pop culture or media?
Oh, no, I don't know. Oh man, I would have to think about that. I would have to think about that to give you a very thoughtful answer. But the first person that comes to my mind, of course, is the Queen Lizzo. I mean, we have never seen anybody like her at all. And I mean, like we have seen a lot of people, and I would, maybe I would say Lizzo is a mix between like Missy Elliott and Little Kim as it pertains mm-hmm. to kind of like being out, like their extrovertedness, and then also just kind of like the risqueness of how Lizzo presents her content. She is unapologetically fact, and I love that about her. And she shows every inch of her body. And I think that has just been that's been helpful for me to see that on TV, to see her taking up so much space. If I thought about it a little bit more, I probably could, to get a really good example, but I do feel very seen, from Lizzo.
That's great. I loved seeing her come out, and her lyrics too are so unapologetic. And you're like, we don't hear that a lot. There's still a lot of lyrics about being a certain way for someone else, or trying to win someone back, or trying to be the object of someone's affection, when yes. really you could just be your own soulmate and love yourself and be obsessed with yourself because you're good enough as you are now.
Yep. 100.
Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to thank you so much for being here with me today. This was so fun. It went by so fast.
It did. And we really just were chatting it up.
I know. Awesome. Well, thank you again. I appreciate you, and we will see you next time.
Thank you.